On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, a test of diplomacy ahead of the Kim-Trump summit. What's next? And a celebration of the Lantern Festival and China's lunar exploration program. Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN from Beijing. We begin today's show with relations between the DPRK and the U.S. a week ahead of the second meeting between U.S. President Donald Trump and the DPRK leader Kim Jong-un. The U.S. is sending a negative signal, some say, to the DPRK side. Reuters reports the Trump administration is trying to block the DPRK's attempt to improve its civil aviation. Let's take a look.
A move seen as part of a negotiating tactic. According to Reuters, the Trump administration pressured the International Civil Aviation Organization to drop plans with the DPRK to open a new air route that would travel through both the DPRK and South Korean airspace. Pyongyang's plan was seen as a potential effort to revive the country's commercial airline industry, which has been paralyzed by ICAO regulations that direct planes to avoid the DPRK due to the threat of unscheduled missile tests. Insiders say the Trump administration seeks to block the DPRK from obtaining anything it truly needed until it took concrete action to dismantle its nuclear program. So far, only a limited number of airlines, including the DPRK state-owned venture Air Koryo, currently offer a small number of flights to the country every year. Last June, U.S. President Donald Trump and the DPRK leader Kim Jong-un held an unprecedented meeting in Singapore. In a joint statement, both sides agreed to forge new peaceful relations. The U.S. could provide security guarantees to the DPRK, and the DPRK would work toward a complete denuclearization of the Korean peninsula. With the second meeting going to be held in Hanoi at the end of this month, how could the DPRK respond to the rather unfriendly U.S. move?
For more on the latest exchanges between the DPRK and the United States right ahead of the Kim-Trump summit, with us in Washington, D.C., we have Sharon Squassony, who is a research professor at the Alias School of International Affairs at George Washington University. In Washington, D.C., we are also joined by Jenny Tang, the managing editor of 38 North. In our Beijing studio, Mr. Zhao Tong, a fellow at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. I want to welcome all of you on the Chinese Lantern Festival. Happy New Year to the three of you. Let me start by asking you, though, Jenny, how should we understand the mixed messages between DPRK and the United States right before the summit?
You know, I think it's one of these matters where the U.S. is trying to leverage as much of its leverage as it can. You know, this is one of these matters where there's always been some concern that the international community, and especially South Korea, has been moving too far, too fast, without seeing actual progress on the technical side of North Korea's denuclearization process. And I think this is one of those avenues in which the U.S. is trying to regain some of that control over how much North Korea benefits from just the diplomacy side until it actually starts to do some action. And certainly it is a bit of mixed messaging, but it may also be part of the negotiations that are ongoing right now in the lead up to the summit, and that may be one of the reasons why they've chosen to do this right now.
What we know, Ms. Squassony, is the fact that there have been media reports, intense media reports, shall I say, coming from different sides, suggesting sources from both the DPRK and the U.S. trying to suggest that they are working to exchange liaison personnel. But of course, that's only sources without really knowing exactly what the sources are. Ms. Squassony, what is your understanding of both this information and the way this information got out?
Well, I don't have any inside information on that, but it makes eminent sense to me. You know, if we were to exchange liaisons, issues like these, reestablishing air travel could be done at a much lower level. It wouldn't, rise up to the political level. So it makes a lot of sense. I'm not sure why that was leaked now. I'm sure we're going to see a lot of interesting bits of information right up to the summit.
Mr. Zhao, your thought about possible still continuing mixed messages coming from both sides. Are we going to see a very dramatic week right before the summit?
I'm afraid the recent developments are pointing to a more disappointing week ahead of us. We all know that the top priority, the top demand of North Korea is to get some of the economic sanction pressure off. But the U.S., by refusing to allow North Korea to open its airspace to foreign airliners and therefore denying North Korean capability to collect overflight fees for doing so, it shows that U.S. Still wants to maintain a very strict and comprehensive economic pressure regime, sanction regime against North Korea.
I see.
And that means they appear unlikely to make a real breakthrough on the issue of denuclearization. Both sides are digging in on the core issues. North Korea on not giving up their existing nuclear capabilities, and the U.S. on preserving and maintaining existing economic sanction regime. So that's a disappointing sign. And also, they are only talking about secondary issues, setting up political liaison offices, making a possible bilateral declaration on non-hostility against each other.
I see.
Those are meaningful steps, but those are secondary issues. So I think those evidence putting together, we are unlikely to see a real breakthrough in Hanoi.
Whether breakthrough or not, it seems that President of South Korea and President of the United States are listening to our conversation. According to the latest news report coming from Yonhap news agency coming from South Korea, the two presidents talked to one another on the phone. Moon and Trump hold telephone talks on upcoming U.S. and the DPRK talks, according to Yonhap news agency. Moon, who is the South Korean president, says that South Korea ready to resume inter-Korean cooperation if it will help denuclearization. On the other hand, the U.S. president said he expects, that's in his words, reported by Yonhap news agency, great progress at the second summit with the North Korean leader. That's the latest we are getting from the Twitter tweets coming from Yonhap news agency, South Korea. I want you to respond to that, Ms. Tao. Now, you earlier mentioned whether South Korea, in the U.S. eyes, is going too far in giving, the carrots to DPRK before the latter committed to any real change. What does this say, the latest telephone conversation, as I just read, the content of it, show about the different views reflected by that conversation on the phone between the two presidents?
Well, I think there is probably a lot more going on than what people want to believe. And I think a lot of the expert community and a lot of the pundits are really expecting disappointment and expecting failure. But given some of the remarks that have come from Ambassador Began, for instance, in his speech at Stanford recently, it does seem that there are concrete measures on the table. And I think, if you have the expectation that this next summit, both sides are under pressure to come away with something concrete, not just political will. And certainly those things are being discussed now. And so on the North Korean side, it does sound like they are willing to address their fissile material production capability, the extent of which we won't know until after the summit is over. And the U.S., has to do corresponding measures as well. And whether that's actual sanctions relief, or if it's, it's a matter of measures that will help improve relations, such as the liaison offices, and talk about this political declaration to end the war. But to start the process off on actual redefining relations and starting this peace regime and really triggering an actual peace treaty negotiation,
right.
As well as perhaps exemptions for specific inter-Korean economic cooperation projects to go in order to keep that momentum going and keep that process going. I think this is actually a good outcome to the summit because it really can refocus, reset that agenda, focus attention on the working level as to what comes next. But certainly it's not the end of the road. And unfortunately, a lot of people, this will never satisfy the skeptics in this process, but it will be enough to kind of get us over that hump, get us moving in the right direction, and provide an opportunity to actually start to build a track record of implementation and start to build trust between our countries.
Mrs. Guasoni, you know, if you read the words closely, South Korean president said if it could help with denuclearization, he would resume the inter-Korean cooperation. Obviously, he is trying to suggest to President Trump what should be the next step. After all, the talk and the summit is supposed to help with denuclearization anyway. So, Ms. Guasoni, how much a factor the efforts and momentum coming from Seoul will be in the Washington decision-making when it comes to what should be the next step and the intensity of the talks and the kind of goals that Washington would like to set for the second round? Would there be any way that Seoul could impact?
Well, you know, if we look at past negotiations, it's a very delicate dance between what the U.S. does with North Korea, what South Korea does with North Korea, and so I think President Moon is trying to say, look, if you need a little more support, we're here to help. Whether the United States is really open to that, I'm sure they are at lower levels. Because after all, I'm not sure we would be here today without the thaw in relations between North and South Korea. But, you know, as we can see from this issue of air travel, you know, sometimes North-South relations get a little bit ahead of what's happening with the U.S. and North Korea. I think Jenny Town is absolutely correct. There are a lot of expectations. There were a lot of expectations for the first summit. I'm hopeful that this next summit produces a little more. I would hate to think that we have to go through these very high-level summits to get any progress at all, but so I think what the goal should be for this one is to set up a process with people on both sides and also looping in the South Koreans that the North Koreans can trust that they actually can take some concrete steps and we can sort of build these parallel steps to move forward.
Right.
You can't do this at the very top levels. That is not going to work. So you really have to put a structure in place.
That's true. Well, whether this specific talk next week will be able to help with the momentum at least to establish a structure, that is likely to be the question to be observed. But on the other hand, Mr. Zhao, to you as well, I mean, if you look at the air traffic, air aviation thing, that is mainly about whether the United States is willing to lift the UN sanctions against the DPRK and other types of unilateral sanctions against the DPRK, because obviously some of the UN aviation-related organizations have already begun the process of reconsider whether the air route can be resumed between other parts of the world and also Pyongyang. But it was the United States that said, well, wait a minute, maybe we need something else before that happened. So. But the question really is, how long will U.S. be able to continue this type of influence if, let's just say, Pyongyang shows a very pleasant face through the second round of negotiation? After all, the first time, it did.
Well, in fact, to reopen the North Korean airspace was originally a North Korean idea. It was proposed by North Korean leader Kim Jong-un in February last year to the South Korean president. And then South Korean president tried to persuade the United States to take this idea, but the United States ultimately declined. That really showed the limited role of South Korea. With that said, I think the general direction is very clear. The U.S. does not have that much coercive leverage. North Korea has a new strategic goal of focusing on economic development, and therefore it has to continue its charm offensive to the international community, regardless of the results of the U.S.-North Korea bilateral negotiation. So there will be no missile flying, there will be no nuclear tests for the foreseeable future. So for that political reason, it's hard for the United States.
Well, you just make a big statement. Did you realize that, Mr. Zhao?
But I think it's a reflection of the reality we are living in.
The logic that could
and
be
also,
here.
more importantly, North Korea is painting an image that it can sustain its economic development even with all the existing sanctions in place.
Yes.
So over time, that kind of undermines the efficacy of American pressure campaign.
Yeah.
So I think as time goes on, U.S. will sooner or later realize it has no option but to continue down the route of further engagement with North Korea.
Yeah.
So the sanction regime will sooner or later, I think, erode.
Well, sooner or later, that's a very important question, whether it's sooner or later. Mrs. Guasoni, one of the things that we really want to make clear is that whether the outside pressure is going to be a big factor in the U.S. calculation about its timetable and its tit for tat, whether it's in positive or negative sense toward the DPRK. How much of it is about the domestic politics and also about the timeline for President Trump to think about 2020?
Well, last year, I thought it was all about 2020 and the president election, but I'm not really sure anymore. I do think that President Trump views his relationship with Kim Jong-un as a very personal thing. I think he is looking at this as potential legacy, but honestly, it's really hard to see what is motivating him. I think we're lucky so far in having Secretary of State Pompeo very fully engaged and having Steve Biegun, the negotiator, fully engaged. But I'm not sure that domestic politics plays such a role here. I think Mr. Trump is an opportunist that in a lot of ways, he'll declare victory where there is no victory. And to me, that is one of the risks of having him really in the driver's seat for all of this. I don't think it's helpful to anybody to declare victory when we haven't gotten anything concrete.
But when you think about that, when you think about that, Ms. Tao, 1994, I was discussing this with Mr. Zhao before coming into the studio. 1994, you also heard about the news that the U.S. and the DPRK were trying to exchange liaison officers with one another, and then later a sequence of events happened, and of course that was pulled off. Every step of the way, the question will pop up anyway, and it's legitimate that we're going to see a cycle, as we did before, or we're going to see a start of a real change. To you, Ms. Tang, what's likely to be the one that would, the issue that would help us to understand and help us to judge?
Well, it's really going to be in North Korea's hands, to be honest. The idea that what's happening now is more than just a Trump initiative and more than just Trump's ego or Trump's legacy at play is going to be in how much progress is actually made before he leaves office. Do we have enough progress on the technical side to have confidence built, to have trust built that this is a real process going forward that should be continued? And that's really the big question, and so those are big shoes to fill. And certainly, we do have to question Trump's motives as to why North Korea has been such a central issue to his policies, and a lot of it, may be for the wrong reasons, but may still get the right results. And so the question is how much is North Korea willing to do in this time frame that would build confidence enough to be sustainable through a political transition if Trump doesn't win re-election. And that's really hard to say. And like I said, it's really in North Korea's hands at this point.
You see it quite clearly, Mr. Zhao, though. Leading up to the summit, both sides, both the U.S. and the DPRK, began to talk about different things, actually, in their bilateral relations, if there is something like that. For example, you see much more international reporting, even from the American press, talking about the economic development inside the DPRK, whether it's in a sarcastic way or it's in a very positive way. But reports like that are coming out. You also heard reports coming from the DPRK side talking about their willingness to further develop their economy, their leaders going to the factories, the companies, trying to say we need to have a better economic future. So, Mr. Zhao, are these atmosphere creators? Or actually these, according to your years' experience of research on the issue, what's actually going on the ground, Mr. Zhao?
I think fundamentally all these new developments in North Korea towards economic development were all enabled by a basic fact, which was North Korea acquired a rudimentary but credible nuclear deterrent by the end of 2017. After resolving its security concerns, that enabled North Korea to shift towards economic development. And also, I think a more important point is that also enabled North Korea to fully start on the path of improving relationship with the United States. We talked about the previous effort by the two sides to normalize relations that failed. One important reason of that failure was North Korea was not that certain at that time about its choice of opening up to American and Western influence. It flirted with the idea of setting up a liaison office in D.C., but later on withdraw from this concept.
But the question is
this time was
now?
different, but not
Really?
North Korea with a rudimentary nuclear deterrent. It got its security concern addressed by its own means. So that enabled North Korea to be able to focus on economic development, but also to be able to open up to full engagement with the United States. I think North Korea now has a much firmer attitude towards normalizing relations with the United States.
Right.
For the same reason, I believe North Korea has great stakes in maintaining this current bilateral negotiations ongoing for as long as possible. It has a great interest in preventing this bilateral negotiation fail. So I think we have a different situation, so there's a bigger chance that the bilateral normalization could be achieved.
But Mrs. Guasani, if I could just be frank here, given the style of governance that you have seen in Washington over the past few years, the North Koreans, the DPRK, they might be thinking, even if I got a blueprint, will that blueprint be a standby or be abided by Washington, whether it's this administration or if there were any change of administration just 2 years from now? Mrs. Guasani, I guess those are also legitimate questions, isn't it?
There are always legitimate questions with leadership changes. So what you had in the 1990s when we had the agreed framework was, President Bush came into office and decided that, he was going to trash the agreed framework. And so that has to be in the minds of Kim Jong-un and his senior leadership that if Mr. Trump gets reelected in 2020, there's more time to spin this out. And then, but if he doesn't, either you have a Republican, and it's possible a Republican could, there could be a Republican challenger to Mr. Trump, or you have a Democrat in office. I mean, the good news is with a Democrat, no one wants to see North Korea's nuclear risk increase, right? So there will continue to be efforts along the way, and I think there are, some of the Democratic contenders now are probably developing their policies toward North Korea. This exact blueprint of a high-level summits might not work, and so again, if it's possible with this summit to kind of institutionalize this cooperation, that would be the way forward. I completely agree with Mr. Zhao that it's in the North Korean interest to spin this out for as long as possible, and I personally think that denuclearization will take at least a decade or more, and that assumes that Kim Jong-un is prepared to give up his nuclear forces in exchange for significant security guarantees and, of course, economic cooperation.
What do you think, before we go, very briefly from every one of you, a sentence or two, might be and should be the result of the second round if you were sitting there together with President Trump or together with Mr. Kim Jong-un in the negotiation room? Mrs. Squassony, very briefly.
I'd like to see a roadmap with some, I'm just talking about denuclearization now. I'd like to see a roadmap with specific steps that each side will take. Maybe it just goes out to the next 2 years. But it has to be something more than the single sheet that we got of you know, vague declarations from last year's summit.
Okay. More than a single sheet of paper, and it's a blueprint at least for 2 years. Ms. Tao.
I think my expectations are even a little bit lower. But in terms of, you know, getting the concrete steps, you know, whether it's for the next, I would say even 6 months, looking more at sort of the inter-Korean model of how they've been doing their summit process, of defining the next steps, the very tight time frame, again, to build that track record of implementation, build some trust, with the, you know, commitment to meet again to start talking about what the next steps are.
Meeting, well, committing to the next meeting. That's 6 months. That's the plan you would like to have at least. And Mr. Zhao, finally, before we go.
Well, I would love to see a roadmap as well, but I'm afraid that is going to be viewed as a slippery slope towards nuclear disarmament by North Korea. So I don't think that is really likely. I think if both sides can agree for North Korea to give up its fissile material production facilities and other programs to limit and freeze this program, I think that would be a good enough result.
U.S. side? You're not saying anything about the U.S. side, interestingly.
Because I do believe there are important domestic constraints on the United States, but I would like to see the United States to relax or to provide some exemptions to enable inter-Korean economic cooperation programs to go ahead.
I see. Zhao Tong, Jenny Tao, Sharon Squassony, thank you so much for joining us. I'm sure we will knock on your doors once again for your insights and also your advice. Thank you so much for being with us. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program, a celebration of the Lantern Festival here in China, China's lunar exploration program as well. That's up for a discussion right after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Today, the Chinese everywhere around the world are celebrating the Lantern Festival. Therefore, we would also like to wish you Happy Lantern Festival. It falls on the 15th day of the first month of the China Lunar New Year. Lit lanterns taking a crack at lantern riddles, setting off fireworks, serving the traditional tangyuan, and families getting together, all part of this celebration. The festival also marks the first time the full moon appears during a lunar new year. As luck would have it, the supermoon shines bright over the Lantern Festival this year. It happens when a full moon is at its closest point of orbit to the Earth, making it larger than its usual appearance. The moon has also inspired China's space exploration efforts, named the Chang'e after a mythical goddess of the moon. Last time and last month, the Chang'e 4 lunar probe made the first ever soft landing on the far side of the moon, a space milestone, certainly, not only for China, but also for the rest of the world. And here with us in Beijing studio to talk about the moon, the Lantern Festival, and landing on the dark side of the moon, we have two of our Special guest, Tang Jimeng, a freelance movie critic and certainly a cultural commentator. Welcome, sir.
Happy
Lantern
Lantern
Festival to you. And Yang Yuguang, a professor at the China Aerospace Science and Industry Corporation. Welcome as well, Mr. Yang. I know today, in order to come into the studio, Mr. Yang, we are dragging you from your daily routine, which is take a photo of the moon every day from your home balcony.
Well, yes, you know that this today is very special. You know that the moon sometimes is closer to the moon, and sometimes is far from the Earth. And today is our Lantern Festival, and it's coincidence that also is a super moon. It is bigger than common days,
right.
So today is a good day for taking photos.
I'm sure after the show you will be able to finish your daily routine. That is the brightest moon and the biggest moon, super moon, as they say. Well, Mr. Tang, as a cultural commentator and professor of literature, I'm sure your understanding of the moon and the Lantern Festival is a little bit different from just a daily photo.
There's a lot of fantasizing and fascinations with this very huge object out there, which is so colorful this very night, and so that inspires us in terms of writing poetry, writing literature, and also revisiting this great mythology that involves Chang'e. And so in that sense, it's going to be a beautiful night with beautiful memories and beautiful reminders, and so this is a great night of tradition.
If you look at the literature apps that we have on our mobile phones, almost every one of them has lifted all the important points related to the moon throughout our history, whether it's coming from the Tang Dynasty, the Song Dynasty, leading up to the Qing Dynasty, and of course there are modern and contemporary poems about the moon as well. Why are the Chinese so fascinated by the moon? They just can't escape in every point that they write.
I agree. I mean, no other nations on this very planet has been so very fascinated with the moon. I think the reason is because that mythology has allowed us, for example, this Chang'e especially, I mean, it's all these beautiful human relationships. I think to a large extent the moon represents the Chinese perception of the world, of humanity, and so by using literature to portray and to use point to portray, and in a sense it built this connection, like this bridge that connects Chang'e and her husband, I mean, far out there on the in the universe.
That's right. That's another folklore we have in our history.
Absolutely.
A lot of beautiful memories related to that. Mr. Yang, though, to you it's not just the beauty of the outer space, but also the can-do spirit as well. Chinese orbit landing on the so-called dark side, or rather the far side of the moon, and that is quite unprecedented. As a result of that, how much more do we know about the moon?
Well, you know that we human being has observed the moon tens of thousands years before. You know, it is very interesting that the moon on our eyes is almost the same size of the sun. So it is possible to have the total solar eclipse. That helps the experts on history to study the exact time what event happened during the history. This is very interesting. And besides that, you know that the moon is so important to the Earth. Our seasons are formed due to the angles of the Earth in universe. Well, this angle is kept by the moon. The moon is very important for keeping this angle, and then to keep the seasons of the Earth. This is also very important. And every year you can see the tide, especially tide in Hangzhou in autumn. The tides are formed based on the gravity act on the Earth by the sun and by the moon, especially by the moon.
And these days, people are fascinated by the sci-fi movies that we have just watched in the major theaters across China. It's called the Wandering Earth. It's really ignited people's enthusiasm about exploration of the outer space and also the human's relations to the outer space, of course, moon included. So, Mr. Yang, you know, in the ancient time, you have all these beauty and aesthetics of poetry, literature, paintings, arts related to the moon. But now you have a more concerted determination of being able to explore, not just appreciate. How do you see that, you know, transformation in a way about China's relationship or Chinese relationship with the moon?
Well, you know, that's the Lantern Festival, or the Shangyuan Festival, comes from originally comes from Han Dynasty, about 2,000 years before, when the Han Wudi Emperor prayed in his palace. And this forms the habit of celebrating in maybe Wei Dynasty. The common citizens and civilians are begin to pray, and also this Lantern Festival formed in China. Well, China have already have a good observation of the moon, and our calendar is based on the phase of the moon. You know that our calendar is quite different from Western countries. You know that in the first day of a month in China's traditional calendar, of course, at this moment you cannot see the moon. In the 15th or the 16th, you can see a full moon, absolutely. So our China, the astronomers in Eastern China has observed the moon for thousands of years, and now you know that in this century and last century, the moon is explored by space technology, and we know more information about the moon. Today we have our Chang'e lunar exploration project, so we can have more chance to know more knowledge from the moon, and also to have a better connection with our traditional culture.
And of course, we used to be only reading in the moon. Now, maybe with the technologies developing, humans will be able to go to the moon for commercial flights, even. That would be a very different stage of time. For a literature professor, Professor Teng, from what's being written to what's exactly under your feet, that's going to be a great transformation.
It's going to be very, very interesting transformation, of course. I mean, if you look at, for example, Hong Lou Meng, the Dream of the Red Mansion.
That's one of the four classics coming from Chinese literature.
One of four major classics in Chinese literature, and you will find that the people, the characters are inspired and fascinated by this very moon. But then it's all mythology, it's all mythification, and sometimes it's simply myth, because people are simply ignorant without the help of this modern science and technology. And now with modern science and technology and scientists like Mr. Yang, that we now know what the moon is truly about, right? It's simply just a physical object out there, and so this demystification process is happening with basically transforming our perception from viewing the moon as something very romantic, right? This is a romance thing, but now it's simply an object in this far out universe, and we can reach out to explore.
But you know, for scientists and astronauts, whether it is a harsh or pleasant condition on the moon, of course we know it is not necessarily fit for human beings so far, it's always beautiful, because that goes to the heart of what they are extremely curious about. And that curiosity, to begin with, is always beautiful, isn't it, Mr. Yang?
Exactly.
I see you want to jump into this conversation about beauty and aesthetics.
Yeah, when you know that I have a good relationship with Dr. Buzz Aldrin, the first crew member of Apollo 11 mission to the moon. When he walked on the moon for the first time, he said, "Magnificent desolation." It's so impressive, the view. Although there's no air and no food and no oxygen on the lunar surface, but it is really impressive. And for the scientists, it's also very meaningful in the future. Of course, colonization of the moon is impossible and not necessary for the human being. But the moon in the future will be an important outpost for human being for the future step to the deep space, especially other celestial bodies of the solar system, because we already find water on the lunar surface.
That's true. Talking about beauty, you also see the revival of some traditions. For example, the Palace Museum in Beijing is opening up for the very first time at night to the public. It's usually only open up as a museum during the daytime, but this year, the Lantern Festival, very first time, and a lot of light shows, as they say, beautiful scenes there. But you know, that also has been a change of tradition, isn't it? If you think about the Lantern Festival, it's tranquil, even though it is a family reunion time. So how do you see the modern way of celebrating it Is the spirit still there, or is it only the 热闹, the hustle and bustle about the festival?
Well, nowadays it's not supposed to be hustle and bustling activities. I think it's also, to me, is a cultural revival of our tradition, and perhaps is a way to enable us to look into perhaps a more cultured, enlightened future. I mean, for example, by hanging out all these lanterns and with all these poetries, with all these poems, riddles out there, it is supposed to be a way to enlighten, I mean, to educate and to edify, perhaps, and so to revival this greatness and, of our culture, and perhaps is also a way to share this culture with our international friends from the international community.
Just like the space, it should be shared and should be collectively explored and also investigated. So is the beauty of the culture in a way. So I guess we are running up our time for this discussion. Mr. Yang, you will be a free man after this. You can go back to your balcony and take a daily photo of the moon, this time the supermoon. Thank you so much for both of you for joining us. Happy Lantern Festival to you and your family. Thank you. And the same to you as well. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Inside CGTN into your search engine. Check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Inside team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for more insights across China and around the world.